Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Long. This is The Writing Life, and I just get the coolest guest, and today is no exception. This young lady is a local celebrity, and I say that for a variety of reasons. People in town know her, but we have read her name in the paper more often than any president or celebrity. And so it's really such a pleasure to introduce Starla Pointer.
Thank you.
Welcome. Starla, I looked on I think it was on your either the website or the News Register website.
Probably,
maybe,
yeah.
and it gave the date that you'd started. And I did a quick calculation. It's an estimate, but I think that you've probably done something like 2,700 interviews.
Oh, I think it's a lot more than that.
Is it more than
actually,
that? Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I've been doing Stopping By, my Tuesday feature.
Maybe that was it.
Since 1996, and so that's about 1,350 of those alone.
Okay.
So,
okay.
yeah.
And I think Stopping By was what I looked at. So
could
then
be,
in
yeah.
addition to that, you've done
All kinds of things.
okay.
I've covered people, but every story is people.
Sure.
I've covered the police, and I've covered the courts a little bit in different cities, but I'm more known for feature stories about the arts and also education coverage. I've done a lot of stories of going into schools and talking to children, which is fun.
Yeah, and you know, eventually here we want to get to sort of a year-end wrap-up or a review. But before that, I wondered, do you remember the first article you ever wrote?
I started at the News Register as an intern when I was a senior at Linfield.
Okay.
And
so you're a local lady.
Well, I came to Linfield. I grew up on the Oregon coast, and then I came to Linfield in 1978. And in '82, I had gone to England with a class, and then I came back and right away started my internship at the News Register.
Okay.
And the first big story I did was about the Kelty House in Lafayette, an old house. It's kind of across from the Antique Mall, and the owner at that time was it was in pretty bad shape and was restoring it. But
the house was in bad shape.
Yeah.
The building. Okay.
Yeah, not the owner.
Not the individual. All right. Yeah. That reminds me of a writer sometimes has writer's block. I suspect you don't.
I can't.
Because of the deadline, or because of there's the abundance of material? Or both?
Both. And if I always have more than one thing that I'm working on at a time, and if I do feel like I'm a little bit stuck on something, I wouldn't call it writer's block, but I just move on to something else and then come back. Or, you know, maybe I will write the bulk of the story and then write the beginning of it, or something. Yeah.
I know with me, and I think probably everyone, if you step away from it and come back, you see things you didn't see before.
A lot of times,
or something is gelled, and you get an. I actually get because I do fiction. I would read fiction, somebody else's, and either maybe the voice. I never copy anything, but it triggers an idea.
Sure. I read a lot, just in general. I read a lot of fiction and more fiction than nonfiction. But
do you? Okay.
I read a lot of writers whose work inspires me because they're so good.
Sure.
Like Bachman, the Swedish author of A Man Called Ove.
Sure.
Tony Hillerman, Maeve Binchy, an Irish writer.
Oh, I know her.
Yeah.
That's great.
I just interviewed a woman who grew up in Ireland, or she's born in Ireland, grew up here, moved back to Ireland, and that was in Tuesday's paper about her Christmas traditions. Okay. And I mentioned to her that I'd read all of Maeve Binchy's work, and so we kind of had a starting point of talking about Dublin from those books.
Little diversion here. Maeve Binchy, one of the tree, the birch tree or something. Was that? Am I right?
I think so. Yeah. loved her. So
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask you about writing because writing is your work, it's your employment. Do you write you read other than nonfiction. Do you do any poetry? Do you write essays or?
I have written some bad poetry. As a teenage girl, of course, I wrote angst.
Sure.
And
How cathartic though.
yeah, sure. I had a poetry class at Linfield. I had one poem published in the Oregonians. They did a weekly poetry section then, so that's my claim to fame for that. I've written some children's stories, a series about baby goats, and which I went to schools and read to children, and they drew pictures of the goats, which sometimes had feet like chickens, and it was really fun.
Oh,
so.
that's good. And what grade? Little ones, I guess.
Kindergarten, first grade.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So.
I think you have the soul of an artist, and for that, and do you find this is going to sound goofy, but the difference between fiction and nonfiction is it very different for you, or is it really sort of the two sides of the same thing?
That's a good question. Fiction or nonfiction, of course, should be factual or opinion, and fiction has a lot of factual information in it.
Right.
I learned a lot about Ireland from Maeve Binchy's books.
Sure.
I learned a lot about the Navajo reservation from Tony Hillerman.
Right.
And the best fiction is built on reality,
Right.
with an added element. I don't care for science fiction so much, or fantasy, that there's just made up worlds. I like to learn about the real world.
Yeah.
So
my first novel, it was in Newburgh newspaper. A fella interviewed me, and the protagonist winds up being a truck driver. And the question was, do you think people can relate to things that they've not experienced? And my answer was, I think
sure.
sort of. You read for two reasons. One is to affirm the world you live in, or maybe learn something, but again, it's the world you live in. But then most of us have never been in a mining colony on Mars, and that's at least enjoyable as well. And it depends on how it's written.
Sure. And maybe the mining colony on Mars, we've never been to Mars, but maybe we have a grandfather who was a miner,
Right.
or some other industry that we can relate to, or our childhood or adult dreams of going into space.
Sure.
Oh.
I remember, again, this would be fiction, but to take your own life, to take your own experience, and use that. And particularly in one of my classes, they talked about writing the emotions of a death. Well, maybe you haven't lost a sister or something, but
Maybe you've lost a dog.
a dog,
Yeah,
and right. And so
yeah.
you take those emotions, and it's the same feeling. Maybe you want to expand it, but it's a place to start.
And you've observed others
Sure.
who've been through that.
Yeah.
So.
I wanted to ask you too, in all of this is not going to be fair, but in all of this that you've done, is there a favorite? Does something stand out to you that?
Almost everybody I interview for a feature story, which is a bigger story about themselves, basically, I end up really, really liking, and so it's usually the most recent story I did. But gosh, I've had so many great experiences, and I've had a lot of humorous experiences going into schools and hearing what kids say. Like some kids that were studying about the states, and one of the boys told me he was doing a report on New Hampshire, that kind of thing. And I don't have I have two stepdaughters and two grandchildren, but I don't have children myself, and so they're just endlessly delightful.
Yeah. And again, what when the fellow said that, I guess it was a young man. What grade is that?
I think that was third grade.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember it was at Grand Haven Elementary School, I remember, and the DAR had come in to talk to kids about the Constitution in the states.
Do you know the term mondegreen?
It's not ringing a bell right
Okay,
now.
a mondegreen is when you misunderstand the lyrics to a song.
Oh, sure,
And so
sure.
it sounded like, you know, like
Sure.
a mondegreen.
Like Nights Are Forever Without Hugh.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So I wondered too, maybe the broad category here is people, but is there, thematically, is there something that either repeats or that you gravitate toward? And in fact, you must search out your own material.
Most of
You're
it.
not assigned this.
Mostly, but we talk as a staff, of course.
Okay.
But every story starts with an idea, and that might come from a suggestion that you gave me, or someone called and gave me and said, I have a neighbor who's really does some great stuff. I think you should interview him, which is usually a great way to find stories. Or maybe there's a holiday coming up and I want to find a couple that's been married for a long time for
Okay.
Valentine's Day.
Oh, sure.
Or there's something, some national event or international event, like when the Ukraine war started.
Right.
I looked for local people who had some kind of relationship to Ukraine. I interviewed a woman who'd been in the Peace Corps there, and a girl who was an exchange student at Mac High that I'd interviewed before. She was from Georgia, and so she had remembered
Some proximity.
and
how, so I guess the student would maybe know in a different way. How did you find the person? How do you search these people out?
sometimes, every once in a while, we'll put something on our website or in the paper that we're looking for certain, people who remember 9/11
Sure.
or have something to say about 9/11. Sometimes it's from other members of our staff know of people.
Right.
Maybe they've heard them testify at the city council meeting or something. And sometimes I know a lot of people
Right.
now, so I might call up one person and say, I know you were interested in this, but do you know anybody who's interested in this?
Sure.
and find them that way. Also, I hate to admit that I look at Facebook, but I do.
That's research.
I look at local Facebook pages and sometimes see something that leads me to contact someone, and maybe somebody who's opened a new business. Or just recently, I saw a man from here who went to Poland with the daughter of a Ukrainian woman, and he'd posted, "We're here in the airport. We're getting ready to bring Grandma home."
Oh,
And,
really? Okay.
Yeah, and so that will be in next Tuesday, I think, paper.
Okay.
So.
Do you? I'm trying to think how to put this together. You've done so many interviews. I think whenever you do, whenever the pool is big enough, whether it's population or number of interviews, you'll just inevitably run into something.
Sure.
Have you gotten into a situation ever where you're not in sync with the subject, the person? Have they ever, I don't know what, been belligerent? Or?
I did a couple stories about a former man who had a gender reassignment,
Okay.
and this was back more than 20 years ago, so
Right.
it wasn't
Well, not common.
part of the normal discussions every day, and
Sure.
and I got some calls about that. One man kind of it wasn't a death threat, but he would have been happy had I died.
And this
So,
is a reader, not the subject.
No, not the subject. No,
Yeah.
this was a reader.
Yeah.
Or maybe he didn't read the story, maybe somebody told him about it. That's always possible. Every once in a while, I get a call, or we get a call from someone who says, I heard that you wrote about this. And
Isn't that something?
yeah. But for the most part, people have been very kind and very positive and very, sometimes said, boy, I learned something from this, and that's always really rewarding.
Yeah. And
So-
again, I would think more often that's a reader. They're exposed
I hope
to
so,
something.
yes.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, in an interview, it could be something.
Yeah,
could have been
during an
revealed.
interview, you know, people, there have been people that I certainly don't share the same beliefs as
Right.
when I've interviewed them, but my beliefs are not pertinent when I'm interviewing somebody.
No.
There was one man who I was interviewing him, and he made a racial slur,
Okay.
and this was a long time ago. I was fairly young, and I wasn't really sure if I should say something to him,
Yeah.
I mean, it was patently untrue,
Sure.
but I didn't say anything to him, and I think about that from time to time, and I wished that I had,
Okay.
so,
Not to get too topical or
Uh-huh.
controversial, but in our recent, being the United States'
Uh-huh.
recent history here, we had somebody say something pretty untoward in an interview on television. And when I heard that, I thought the fallout would be swift and decisive. And it turns out it didn't matter very much.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I feel very fortunate that people are so open with me. You know, I don't want to hear them. I guess I'd rather know if they are, know how they think than to not know.
To have it be a facade.
Yeah,
Yeah. This is a fun discussion. I've never
Yeah.
thought of this. I don't know. I'm kind of forming these thoughts as I speak here. But your job is sort of like you're just capturing this.
right.
You're not guiding it. You're capturing it.
That's definitely what I'm trying to, yeah.
Yeah,
To,
and so
to represent them how they are.
right.
And in many cases, I'm sure that a lot of people, they're kind of shaping it how they want to be,
Sure.
but it's not, I don't cover politics, thank goodness, so,
Right.
I'm not trying to show them in a light that I have already come up with and decided that they're
Right.
like this, and I want to show them, in a bad light, so,
Well, you're not going to change them.
no.
And as you were speaking, I thought of the phrase, the best disinfectant is sunlight.
Sure,
And
yes.
so when somebody exposes themselves, you're just a conduit between them and the reader.
Right.
And let the
Right,
reader decide,
right.
take that information and make up their own mind.
Right. I am not a pundit. A lot of the people watch on national television news they are not news people, they're opinion people,
Right.
and that's not what I do.
Yeah.
My opinion doesn't matter in this context.
Right. Again,
So-
because you're just capturing the
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
Speaking of pundits, I think maybe I didn't pay as much attention prior to the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but it seems to me that the division, the cultural division, has been exacerbated by
That
these
seems,
people.
yeah, and
And I
it's
think
gotten
some of
a
them,
lot worse.
Coincidentally, I disagree with them. Keep the pot stirring.
Oh, sure.
They'll seek out topics that are almost irrelevant,
Mm-hmm.
except it stirs people up. Yeah.
Yeah. The person you were referring to on television who
Yeah.
made a racial slur, does he really believe that, or is that an attention-getting device?
Sure.
So, I think in general people are good, and I am fortunate to get to be around a lot of people who are
Yeah.
just wonderful people, and they're all individuals, and they're all different and unique, and
Right.
so, yeah.
In my mind, this leads me to really the kind of the crux of our interview.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, the newspaper business is certainly in transition.
Mm-hmm. I never expected this when I was
Yeah,
growing up and wanting to be a newspaper reporter, and
yeah.
but
Can you talk about that, the changes that you've seen, and the challenges that you're facing?
well, I can't really, I don't have the expertise to talk really about the business, but some of the things that I see are a lot of government organizations and being more careful about what, wanting to curate the information that they let out.
That I
And,
didn't know.
yeah,
Oh,
like,
that they want to let out.
right,
Oh, okay,
right. And
okay.
so, when I covered the police in the 80s and early 90s, I would go down to the police station and talk to the officers, and and it was, there'd been some kind of incident, and an hour or so later I talked to people, and now, and I'm not criticizing them, but I wish it wasn't quite as formal as it now. Now, they have to do their press release, and it has to go up the chain of command and be signed off on, and and
Oh, I
it's
didn't know any of that.
yeah, well, that's frequently the case.
Yeah.
But so, it feels like we're hearing, not, and I don't mean to single out the police, but
Yeah.
it feels like we often are hearing what they want us to hear rather than the raw information.
Uh-huh.
And at the same time, with all the social media, there's all these people who are immediately, they see two police cars go down their street, and they're immediately on their Facebook page saying, oh, two police cars went down the street, so the people in this house must be druggies or something like that. And when, I want to report the truth and the real information, and not report what somebody's jumping to conclusion
Right.
about. And so in that case, in that incident, that makes it take a little longer for it to be in the newspaper
To
than
be
for it to be on Facebook. But
Yeah.
I'd rather have the full story and the real story
Yeah.
than be first. Although first is nice.
Yeah. Starla, I think that you would not call yourself an investigative reporter?
No,
Okay.
no, I wouldn't.
But when you, and I'm just asking because I don't know.
And I'm not sure entirely what everybody means when they say
That's
that.
what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it seems like when you get in there and you say, well, no, I'm not going to accept
Yeah,
what
well,
just popped out. Well, or even
mhm.
the curated information, maybe there's more to it than
Right,
that.
right.
So in a sense, you are digging a little bit.
Mhm. I would hope that if anybody sends me a press release, that I would at least call them and talk to them about it, and
Sure.
try to find out more information,
Yeah.
and because I feel like also that I will ask more questions than they have asked before they
Oh,
send
sure.
out their press release, and so maybe I will find out more information, or information that they wouldn't think was important, but I think is fascinating.
Or maybe
for
they
a
thought it was
story.
important and not flattering.
Well, it's, yeah, that's possible.
Yeah.
So,
I don't want to run out of time before we get to this.
see, I was so nervous beforehand, and it's been easy.
Oh,
to-
no, I've told you this is so easy.
Mhm.
2022, we're coming to the end.
Mhm.
Is there anything that characterizes this period? Is there a kind of a trend in the news or in society, or that you've observed, or how do you see
Yeah.
2022?
Well, of course, we've gotten a little bit more back to normal after COVID, and
Right.
the school closures and restaurant closures, and a lot of gatherings, like they were able to have the UFO festival parade
Right.
again, and have the trick or treating downtown, and yet there's still concerns about communicable diseases, of course,
Right.
but I've seen a lot of people be really relieved and happy to just go out and see people again, and
Oh, sure.
and of course that's really been the overwhelming thing that I've seen. And,
Uh-huh.
but at the same time, people are. I was just a couple people I passed on the street today, and they won't look you in the eye,
Really?
you know, and and so it seems like there's this permanent change, or hopefully temporary change, that people are just kind of keeping away from strangers a little bit more, and that saddens me, you know. I like to say hi to people.
Oh, sure. When we moved for context, from Southern California to McMinnville, I was naive, but I think there was some truth in this. I likened McMinnville to Mayberry. And some of the encounters I had were just delightful. In fact, we were here the day before our first alien parade. And I remember writing to a friend, I said, the town is charmingly unsophisticated. and again,
I think that's
not
a
true.
good thing, though. I mean,
Oh, I loved it. I
that
thought
kind of innocence.
Yeah. And it seems to me, again, either I have more exposure, having been here a while, or there is an actual change. It seems a little rougher.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a reflection of society.
Yeah. Well, I think so. The bigger, more people.
Sure.
But this town, there's a real good heart, I think, to McMinnville, and
Yeah.
People give to charities and children's causes, and people volunteer and help each other out. And,
As you said earlier, most people are nice. So
yeah.
we've got about 2 minutes, and so I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you said you can't talk about the business part.
Well,
Newspaper.
I'm not that informed
Yeah.
about it. It's all.
But you're certainly an insider. Could you make a prediction about newspapers into the future?
Well, community newspapers like the News Register, I think I think they're an important part of the
Absolutely.
community. I think they're necessary. I think we need to be a watchdog over school boards and
Right.
the county commissioners and city councils, and I think and bigger papers are less personal.
Sure.
And, I mean, they may hopefully hold the government accountable, but they're not going to have a lot of stories about your neighbor that collects cat figurines, for instance, and that's something that a community newspaper really fills our desire to know one another, and know our neighbors, and know the good things about each other.
Right.
So
I can't remember if I was talking to your boss or who said this, but early on, Facebook wanted to be mentioned or supported by the newspapers. And whoever I was talking with says it's really flipped now, that they've sort of taken the place of a lot of this. And maybe it's the instant posting that you've talked about.
yeah, well, the big difference between Facebook or social media, I think, and the newspaper is that in the newspaper you're going to have a common experience, and you're going to hear about the people that you agree with and people you don't agree with. And on Facebook, people tend to just hear the information that they already agree with.
Confirmation bias.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's
Yeah.
that feedback loop.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the other thing that you folks don't get enough credit for is professionalism. You're a trained journalist.
Right.
And
I
you have
certainly
standards.
don't have an opinion that I try to keep that out of
Sure.
every story.
Sure.
Although I do love cats. And
Well, we look forward to that in the future.
we're going to go see some kittens next Tuesday, so
Okay. All right. Starla Pointer, thank you so much.
Oh,
This
well,
was
thanks.
a delight. You're a delight.
thanks. That wasn't as difficult as I
Wasn't
feared.
Wasn't so bad.
Well, thank you.
Folks, you bet. That's another Writing Life. Thank you so much. And I've said before, if you want to go to my website, stephenwlong.com, and just tell us what a great job we're doing, or the other, or you have a suggestion for a guest, and I'm lonely, so drop me a line. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I know you were a little reluctant.
Just scared.
Yeah.
Just scared. So
We're pretty harmless.
yeah, that went by really quickly too.